So if you watched anime for long enough, you've probably picked up on words such as baka, kawaii, or sugoi. But some of the most interesting things about anime in Japanese are not those separate words, but rather dialects, or character speech patterns, or even social cues that are often disappear completely in the English dub. Today I want to show you several features of Japanese linguistics that you can actually start noticing when watching anime, and once you notice them, you'll never hear anime dialogue the same way again. But first, this video is sponsored by updf. Since I'm currently in Japan, I've been trying to force myself to read a little more Japanese, and the other day I stopped by a bookstore and picked up this book because I thought the art inside of it looked kind of interesting. And so while reading it, I came across a page that I really wanted to understand a little bit more carefully. Let me try and find it for you. So the majority of the book has furigana in it, so you have the kanji and then you have the furigana, but at some point there is this image which I cannot read, and I was kind of curious as to what it meant. So I could look up every unfamiliar word individually and then copy passages into different translation tools and keep my notes somewhere else entirely, or I could just do it all in one place, which is what updf does. So I took a photograph of the page that I was interested in, these two, and I put it into updf. And since this is just a scanned page, the first thing I can do is use the ORC to convert it into selectable text. And now I can highlight interesting phrases and add notes directly into the document. So for example, let's say that there's a sentence or expression that I'm not sure about. Instead of manually searching through dictionaries and grammar guides, I can open the AI assistant and ask it to explain exactly what is going on. For example, if I didn't know what kuchi ga kikenai rashikatta, what that rashikatta means, I could put it into updf and then have the AI chatbot help me understand what that means. If I'm working through a longer text, I could also ask it for a summary of the page before diving into all the details. So for example, for this book, at the end, there is these massive chunks of text that also have furigana in them, but it would be nice if I could have someone summarize what this is about, if it's part of the text or if it's just additional biography of the author, for example. And if I want to review material while doing something else, I can also use the read aloud feature, and then it can create the audiobook for me. So I can clean around the house whilst also getting Japanese input as I do something else. For language learning, research, or just keeping notes organized, it's a really convenient way to keep everything in one place. If you'd like to try updf yourself, there's a special offer available through the links in my description below. And thanks again to updf for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to Japanese linguistics. So let's start with dialects. Before we get into anime specifically, there's one thing that's worth clearing up, and that is that a lot of people hear the word dialect and think of accent, but those aren't actually the same thing. An accent is mostly about pronunciation, while a dialect can involve pronunciation like pitch accents or different phonemes, but it can also include different vocabulary, different grammar, and sometimes a completely different way of expressing the same idea. One of the biggest patterns in specifically Japanese dialects is this east-west divide. Tokyo, Yamanashi, Aomori share a number of eastern features, while Osaka, Hiroshima, and Fukuoka share a number of western features, for example. Of course, this is a huge oversimplification, but it's a useful place to start. And I'll try and show you a cool ways of identifying where a character is from if you know a little Japanese. And of course, because this is an animation and linguistics channel, I will use animation as examples. One of the easiest examples specifically for this dialect variation is a fan project that redubbed songs from Frozen into different Japanese dialects, specifically the For the First Time and Forever reprise. And the project includes versions of the Tokyo dialect, Osaka, Hiroshima, Fukuoka, Aomori. There's also the Okinawan dialect, and several others. And so I will try to give you some easily identifiable words and tendencies, so the next time you're watching something in Japanese, you can start noticing them for yourself. I'll start with one of the easiest things to identify, and that is personal pronouns. So normally in Japanese in Tokyo, it would be watashi or atashi. There is a slight variation between atashi and watashi, but I will talk about that a little bit later. So for the east, it's atashi, but for the west, it's uchi. So Osaka, Hiroshima, Fukuoka is uchi. And Okinawa, considering that it's so far away from everything else, in the mainland Japan, there they say wan. So instead of atashi or watashi or uchi, they say wan. There's a similar kind of divide in terms of grammar as well. So if you say don't go in Tokyo, it's something along the lines of ikanai de, ikanai. But in Osaka, it's ikan de. In Hiroshima and Fukuoka, it's just ikan de. Those are the variations that we see in this frozen version of dialects. This is slightly more nuanced, but in the eastern portions they also use da, and whilst in the western portion they often use ya. So, but still in Tokyo it's dakedo, in the Yamanashi version it's dakendo, in the Aomori it's da domo. They always use the da character, whilst in Osaka they have yakedo, in Fukuoka it's also yakedo, in Hiroshima it's jakedo. There's this ya and ja versus da distinction between the two eastern and western regions. And in Okinawan it's even more different as per usual, it's yashika. So Okinawan is generally quite different from all the other dialects. And so, but at this point I hope you start seeing this like eastern-western split that characterizes a lot of the different dialect distinctions. That is of course not the only linguistic pattern that is noticed for all these regions. This one might be a little bit more above your pay grade, but some dialectical features spread outwards like ripples. One famous example of this word is the word for snail. If you look at a dialectic map of Japan, the different words for snail form in these like circular rings around Kyoto, Osaka area. When a new word becomes popular in that area, it starts spreading outward, and before it finishes spreading across the entire country, another word appears and starts spreading as well. And the result is that different regions preserve different layers of linguistic history. Keep going far enough from the mainland Japan, you eventually reach varieties that many linguists would even classify as Japanese dialects. The Ryukyuan languages in Okinawa, for example, are generally considered sister languages to Japanese rather than dialects of it. And in the north is the Ainu language, a completely unrelated language which used to be spoken by the indigenous Ainu people of Hokkaido. Both languages are basically almost dead, but there are a few anime that touch on these languages too, like the Golden Kamui that talks about the Ainu language and culture, and Mugen from my favorite Samurai Champloo series. He's from the Ryukyuan Islands, and so they incorporate different cultural aspects of these two areas. And in animation, these dialects are particularly important because they can also tell you something about how the audience is supposed to perceive that character. Just like accents in English language media, certain Japanese dialects have become associated with certain character archetypes over time. And these character archetypes are further emphasized in a cool linguistic concept called Yakuwarigo, or role language. And role language is a way of speaking that makes you imagine a certain type of character, be it an old man, a samurai, a princess, a gangster, a schoolgirl, a wizard, a robot. Think of Yoda, but in Japanese maybe. That is like the old GG archetype. Maybe this sounds a bit abstract for now, but I'm going to show you some of the most common examples of Yakuwarigo in anime. And chances are you've probably heard of all of them before, but just didn't realize what they signify. So I'll start with Kamaji from Spirited Away, or Sen to Chihiro no Kimikakushi. And Kamaji uses washi, or I, for his pronoun, which is a classic old man pronoun in anime. And he also ends sentences with ja, or instead of da, immediately making him sound like elderly, specifically an old man. But Kamaji is also not just a generic grandpa character. He also uses a number of Western Japanese dialect features, as I mentioned before. So instead of saying ikanai, like the Tokyo version, he says ikan. The is very Western. And naran instead of naranai. Toru instead of teiru is also another feature of this specific dialect. So ikan instead of ikanai, naran instead of naranai, toru instead of teiru. So a standard speaker might use nani o shiteiru no, and Kamaji could say something like nani shitorun ja, to hear the ja and the that he uses compared to the standard speaker. And so together all these features make him sound less like an ordinary old man, but also like an elderly craftsman from the countryside. Even though real people don't talk like this, for anime audiences they can immediately recognize that what this character type represents. It's essentially a linguistic costume design to a certain extent. So this was the old man and also Western Japan trope. For the next trope, I wanted to use a girly girl, like a rich girly girl example. We're going to use Beatrice from ReZero. Her speech is extremely recognizable, mainly because she constantly uses sentence endings like kashira or no yo. And kashira is a very feminine, slightly old-fashioned way of softening a question or wondering out loud. If you just say atsui, it's just like, oh, it's hot. Atsui kashira is like, oh, could it possibly be hot?
可愛いお子さんだこと。でも残念ながらうちの子には負けるのかしら。
可愛いゴリさんですね。ちょっと抱かせていただいてよろしいかしら。でも残念ながらうちの子には負けるかしら。
And instead of sounding like a normal casual expression, it gives the line a more theatrical and refined and almost doll-like quality. And noyo has this similar feature. It also adds a feminine explanatory tone. And though the usual form is Teiyo and Wayo for the standard rich girly girls, Beatrice uses Noyo, which also is similar to the yo endings that are usually used. Another thing I forgot to mention before is that usually this aristocratic archetype also has a pronoun associated with them, and that is watakushi. So instead of referring to themselves as atashi or watashi, they refer to themselves as watakushi. And Betty doesn't use this because she refers to herself in the third person, but I did find a character that uses watakushi. And Stephanie Dola, she used to be a princess before she was dethroned, and she still uses the same aristocratic speech patterns that she grew up with. Additionally, characters modeled after older aristocratic women often speak in a more formal and restrained way. So in Tale of the Princess Kaguya, Lady Sagami, she speaks in a highly polite court language with honorific expressions and formal conjunctions such as de gozaimasu or nasaimase or itashimashou, and refers to herself as watakushi, which Beatrice also refers to herself as watakushi, and my guess is that that is where that originated from. This like rich girl aesthetic came from the aristocratic way of referring to themselves as watakushi wa, and then the rich girl was created. And this shouldn't be confused with the more general gendered speech patterns. So traditionally female characters are more likely to use forms like wa endings, wa yo, and atashi. As I mentioned before, Anna in Frozen, she uses atashi or watashi interchangeably in the eastern part of the Japanese dialects. And the distinction between atashi and watashi is atashi is more female-leaning. Watashi, in theory, in textbooks, says that it's neutral, but in reality, it is also slightly more female-leaning because masculine characters tend to use slightly different pronouns. But so Beatrice, she uses all those standard feminine-leaning phrases, but also exacerbates them and sounds not just like a girl, but like a proud, refined, old-fashioned, and slightly arrogant, and very consciously character-like. Because kashira, the way she uses, is kind of strange. I may link a video talking about her specific kashiras. And so, on the male side, one of the most recognizable patterns is again the use of ore as a pronoun, and along with sentence endings like ze and zo. They sound rougher and more confident, more masculine, compared to something like watashi, which is slightly more feminine, or boku, which is more young boyish. So back to ore. One example that came to mind for this particular ore archetype is Junbei from Ninja Scroll. Junbei speaks like a wandering swordsman and frequently uses rough or masculine language. Things like daze or dazo that immediately signals like that he's dangerous or independent and not especially concerned with being polite. The same thing happens with Mugen from Samurai Champloo, as I mentioned before, the guy who was from the Ryukyuan Islands. He also uses ore along with more rough masculine speech patterns like ne instead of nai, shineyo, stuff like that. He sounds completely different from Jin, the other character in Samurai Champloo. Jin sounds more disciplined because he tends to use just the informal dictionary speech version without adding any particular distinctions in the speech pattern. It's very like standard informal dictionary speech. Perfect example of how important this is in Kimi no Na wa, in Your Name, when Mitsuha and Taki's body they switch bodies, and Mitsuha starts talking in her regular feminine pronouns, starting with atashi, and then she says watashi, and then she goes into boku and then ore, and you can see how the other characters are like, huh, why are you using such strange pronouns? She gradually goes from most feminine to more masculine.
どうやったら通学で道に迷えんだよ。
私、
私？
私、僕、
あ？
俺、
And these patterns aren't unique to a single character. They're a broad gender speech convention that has existed in Japan for a very long time. Those like more feminine leaning and more masculine leaning. That being said, there are female characters that use more masculine pronouns and masculine characters that use feminine pronouns. And so in One Piece, for example, you have one of the characters that uses boku instead of atashi or watashi. And you can sense that there is this more boyish atmosphere around this character. There's so many more that I did not mention. Some of them have endings, some of them have just the pronouns that identify with them. There's even like a tiger mom stereotype that says zamas for the endings. There's degozaru for samurai. There are so many different ones that it's just hard to cover all of them. I also didn't talk too much about boku and how that is more for young boyish and like more nerdy characters, but a great example is Boku no Hero Academia. That one is from Izuku's perspective, and he uses boku. It's just noticing all of these distinctions of how people self-identify and what endings they use could greatly help you understand what the image of that character is. Because the speech itself becomes part of the brand, part of the character. The character becomes inseparable from the way they talk. And so that brings us to another feature of Japanese that anime fans notice very quickly, and this is the levels of formality. And unlike English, Japanese speakers constantly move between different levels of politeness depending on who they're talking to. So if you're talking to your boss, you sound differently from when you're talking to your friends. If you're talking to a customer, you're sounding differently than talking to your family. And there are multiple different levels. So at the most polite end, you get things like the honorific language or keigo. And this is the language used for customer service, business settings, formal ceremonies, and interactions between people of higher status. Then you have the standard polite forms with like this, must, which most learners encounter first. And then you have the casual speech with plain forms like da, suru, iku, without the must, this endings, which are common amongst friends, family, and people you're socially close with. So when beginners learn, they usually associate da as just casual speech in general and this as being polite. And that's not wrong, but it's not the entire story. Using this often means you're orienting yourself towards another person. So you're managing a social relationship, you're acknowledging an audience. And that often feels more direct, immediate, and self-expressive. So one way of thinking about it is this is something used when you're speaking to someone, or if you're acknowledging that what you're talking about is for somebody else. And that is often something you use when you're reacting to something, or if you're expressing something for yourself. For example, imagine you suddenly notice a mouse. You don't usually shout, nezumi desu. You would say, nezumi da. And the same thing happens when you suddenly remember something, like, yabai testo da. Like, oh no, there's a test. Or when you realize something is true. Or like, honto da. Like, oh, that is true. Oh yes, that is the case. But you wouldn't say, honto desu. That would be implying that the information you're presenting is for somebody else, for somebody you're talking to, as opposed to your own realization of something. Same thing happens when you're overwhelmed with emotions. It's the tensai da. Like, oh yes, I am a genius. In all of these examples, the speaker isn't really talking to somebody. They're reacting and they're expressing something, and that's why da feels more natural. A character that is known for using this must form is Kuroko from Kuroko no Basket, and there are a few times where he uses the da form, and one of those is when he realizes that the only way for him to play basketball is if he helps and plays with the others. He says, boku wa kage da, so I am the shadow, and this is associated with his decision that he's going to continue playing basketball with a group of people. And there's this drastic change between how he usually talks using the des must form and how he speaks when it's more of an internalized kind of realization. And the most common phrases that you might have heard is characters yelling "uso da," like that's a lie, or "hitori da," which is like, oh, I'm alone. I've realized that I'm alone. Because these are moments of realization, surprise or disbelief, or strong emotions. They're reactions, and if you actually want to make those statements interactive again, Japanese often adds things like yo or ne. For example, for onida yo is like, new notable information has been given to you. There is a demon here. Or onida ne is like, you know, there's a demon, you know. And so now the speaker is bringing somebody else into this conversation. And so for the next part, I wanted to slightly talk about writing systems, because most people know about the 3 Japanese writing systems of hiragana, katakana, and kanji, but what most people don't think about much is that the type of system you use carries meaning with it as well. A brief history first. Kanji came from China, and over time, Japanese writers developed 2 additional scripts from Chinese characters. Katakana was created by Buddhist monks as a pronunciation and annotation system for reading scholarly and religious texts. And Hiragana was developed from cursive handwriting and became associated with literature, poetry, diaries, and personal writing. And you don't really need to remember any of that, but it does help explain why even today hiragana tends to feel softer and more personal, and katakana often feels sharper and more technical and more official. It is also worth noting that for most of Japanese history, wasn't just one type of hiragana, but rather many different versions. So the modern a, I, u, e, o that you learn in textbooks are actually standardized versions chosen from a much larger collection of forms. So these older variants are called hentai-gana, and they never completely disappeared. You can still find them on traditional soba restaurants or old confectionery stores or noren curtains, like in this one old animation. So there was this variety of translations from kanji into hiragana, and then the standardized hiragana was created afterwards. A similar but slightly different thing ended up happening with kanji. Over time, the writing styles of certain characters changed, so now there are multiple official ways of writing certain kanji, mostly due to generational differences. Certain generations wrote kanji in one way, and then gradually with time, different variations started appearing, and now all versions are officially allowed to be used. So there's this tendency for Japanese to branch and carry meaning within those branches. And this tendency continues even today with the 3 writing systems themselves. Usually textbooks will say that kanji carries the core meaning, hiragana carries the grammar, and katakana marks foreign words. And that is true, but just not fully again. Katakana is also used for sound effects, advertising, visual emphasis, and stylistic effects. So in manga, a robot may speak in katakana, mainly because it makes it creates this feeling of strangeness or something unsettling. So katakana use in and of itself can make something feel foreign or cold or alien, or simply emphasize something. Hiragana can make something homely and close, and kanji makes something distant and formal and standard. There's a very good example. It's not an animation, but a film called Watashi to Watashi to Watashi to, which is me and me and me. So the story follows 3 girls, and depending on which watashi is used, they have different problems in their life, and their story is slightly different depending on which watashi is used in the title. So be on the lookout for this in animation or in manga, and think about what meaning is trying to be portrayed to you, depending on the writing system that is being used. So the next time you watch anime, don't just listen to the words, listen to the dialects, the pronouns, the sentence endings, the writing systems. Look out for those too, because some of the most interesting parts of Japanese are hidden in places most translations cannot reach. My hope is that this video gave you a few breadcrumbs, a few landmarks, a way to navigate a language that can sometimes feel like a maze, and maybe the next time a character opens their mouth, you'll hear a little more than you did before. And after all, the goal isn't to eliminate everything that's lost in translation, it's to get a little less lost in the end. Thank you all for watching this video, and I hope that gave you a little bit more motivation to watch everything with subtitles. If you're interested in languages, linguistics, or animation, please subscribe. It helps me out a lot more than you think. And maybe watch some of my other videos. I have a video about world building and how linguistics can help with world building. And I also have another video talking about how language and music are surprisingly related. related. So you can check out any one of those, and I'll hope to see you next time. Bye!